All right. Well, welcome to the Scaling Up Business Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Gallagher, and I have with me today Greg Crabtree, author, consultant, speaker, all-around guru on all things financial. Greg is fantastic for making it simple. In fact, he wrote the book, Simple Numbers, Straight Talk, Big Profits. I've known Greg through the EO Accelerator program, through Gazelles, and we're circling back around in so many different ways. But I wanted to talk to Greg today about the labor efficiency ratio and how to use this as a key metric to tune your business over time and to figure out what to do and so on. It's such a powerful thing and so seldom used by so many. So thanks for being with us, Greg.
Yeah, appreciate it, Bill, and always great to talk simple numbers.
Nice. Well, welcome to the show. So, where are you today?
I'm in Huntsville, Alabama. So that's where our staff is. So we're able to actually, we pretty much do work all over the world. So we've got clients outside of the U.S. as well as all over the U.S. and in Canada. So fortunately, our methodologies allow us to deliver that from right here in Huntsville, Alabama, of all places.
Well, I know. I feel like I run into you in different places from L.A. to D.C. to Dallas and so on. So, and today over the fabulous interwebs. All right. Well, thanks for being with us. So let's start with just a little background before we get into the power and magic of the labor efficiency ratio, the LER. Mm-hmm. How do you come into this? What terrible thing about your childhood had you be in this line of work?
Well, fortunately, what drove me to this line of work is growing up on a chicken farm in Alabama. You realize that you don't want to do that for a living, so you find something else, and particularly you find something that works in an air-conditioned office. I wish there was a greater, loftier reason why I chose accounting, but it was a very fortuitous event. When I was 14, I went with my mom to get her taxes filled out, and I realized that it wasn't so much the fascination of tax accounting. It was the fact that, she had really high regard for the guy, Harry Carpenter, who did her tax return, but he worked in an air-conditioned office, and I thought, gee, that is a whole lot better than dealing with chickens. And so, realistically, I never...
So you went into accounting for the glamour? Is that what you're saying?
That's right, absolutely. Yeah, so... but I will tell you this. I mean, I was listening to an audio book from Dr. Bob Rotella on his latest one, and the name of it escapes me, but I think it's about building successful teams. And so, but he was talking about somebody that told his dad, I think, told him one time, either do what you love or love what you do. Mm. And there was a time that I think I changed my focus, because I'll tell you, the basic accounting that you do coming straight out of college, in most places, you're not given a sense of purpose as to what it means or how it impacts the world. And so it's pretty mundane work. And so there were times in my career where, I tinkered with doing different things. And really the magic came when I realized that, I could actually take this tool and do magical things with it, that really help people run a more profitable business. And really, once we set the purpose of helping entrepreneurs to run profitable businesses, it really just changed our outlook. And so now even our young staff come in with a sense of purpose as to what they're doing, and really we've kind of tightened up kind of our phraseology of it, of just saying, hey, we provide simple numbers for powerful decisions. And that's really what we're aiming at and I do believe it actually works that way, because we keep refining it to where it's fewer and fewer numbers that really matter. And it may not be the greatest in terms of revenue maximization for me, but I'm more about impact than, I'll make a good living and we'll do fine. But at the end of the day, it's doing what does the client need, and what is it that gets them to respond? Because it's really one of the areas that I've really become fascinated with of late has been this area of behavioral economics, And I really have begun to believe that a lot of the work that we do is probably more geared into that genre. It's just that we use accounting to do that impact. And so we've had some really phenomenal success stories of once we present data in truth, people respond to it differently than what they've done when they just do accounting. And I think there's always an excuse when you do things in the traditional accounting approach that lets people off the hook, and they have an excuse, or the dog ate my homework, or, well, that's not completely correct. Well, it says, well, let's define what completely correct is, and I think in our methodologies, we've really helped push to a definition of what financial truth is that isn't generally accepted accounting principles in most cases. But once you establish that definition, we hold people accountable to it. So listen, are you going to accept underperformance, of your business, or are you going to do something about it? And it is extremely gratifying to see how people respond to financial truth in a simplified format.
Yeah, well, I think we can already hear it in your remarks, but I've known you for a few years now, and in your care and generosity and desire not just to produce statements or pass audits, but to actually help business leaders to make thoughtful decisions that impact their business is abundantly clear from all of your work, and not just to have a document produced, but to deliver actionable information. So thank you.
Yeah, it's Eli Goldratt actually wrote a book that impacted me even more than the goal. His book on Necessary But Not Sufficient was an allegory about his own personal life story of being kicked out of his own business because he pursued truth and data. And it was really a fascinating story. And so to a large degree, I think that is probably a good depiction of the accounting profession. And that the numbers are necessary, but it's not sufficient. What is sufficient is entrepreneurs are desiring meaning and direction from it. And once I realized I was sitting on an enormous wealth of intellectual property, which is in essence the intellectual value of the client data that I have deep access to. And I can't reveal, obviously, their, company secrets or those things, but there's really rarely any secrets. But there is data that you can mine to look at and say, what is it telling me? What is it speaking to me? And it was in that process of actually doing a research project on our own client data sets that I didn't get paid for at the moment, but it's paid itself back in many ways later, of developing a way to look at comparing businesses that may be in different industries, but yet putting it on a comparable basis so that we can have a robust discussion. Your business might be different than mine, but we can still structure it in a way that we both can learn from each other and help each other optimize what our business is potentially capable of.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about this, about the idea here. What is it? How do you use it? Like that. Let's start with the definition.
Yeah. So really, the first thing that we always apply to data is the clearing distortions, process. And typically, in most entrepreneur businesses, it's going to be owner's compensation that they don't account for correctly. And we're not going to get into the discussion of tax reasons or whatever, because I'm talking about, whatever you put in your accounting records, that's between you and your tax accountant. But at the end of the day, I always apply the get run over by a bus question. So if you get run over by a bus and your family decides to keep your business going, what would they pay somebody to do the job that you do in the business?
Yeah.
And you have to make a plus up or down adjustment to the compensation lines in the business. And typically, we only have two major lines of compensation that we delineate in the business model. We want to isolate what we call direct labor, which is any labor that faces the customer, a person that spends 50% or more of their time doing whatever you do in your business, whether it be product, service, or whatever. And so we want that person to go into direct labor. And then by default, everybody else goes into management labor. And so in most cases, the owners of the business will fall into management labor. Now, in some cases, like myself, I'm considered direct labor, because I would tell you that CEO title is a little more of a non-functioning title because there's not enough CEOing to do. I mean, we got 25 employees. We'll do about $3 million in revenue. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I carry that title, but that's not my primary job. Now, if we were 10 million, yeah, it'd probably be a full-time job. And guess what? That would be the job I wouldn't want. I would want somebody else to do that job because my highest value is in both the client-facing work and doing more research on data and then also doing some of the marketing, as well. So in our model, I'm considered direct labor. We always tell people, just don't get hung up on classification in that take your pick, put them in one bucket or the other. Just be consistent and put a butt in the bucket. We don't want people splitting somebody because ultimately the idea is we think the methodology helps you work your way out of that, working in the business to working on the business role. Because typically you think of a direct labor role as working in the business. A management labor role is more working on the business in that regard. And so once you isolate the two buckets of labor, there's just a really simple model that, let me talk about kind of the top part that we call the business engine. So we look at revenue minus direct costs that do not include any labor is the key true top line of the business, which we call gross margin. And so, we always tell folks that really revenue is the slipperiest number in any P&L. So really, externally talk about revenue all you want. We really like gross margin as being internally the highest quality number to start the value chain of what you look at. And then the relationship of direct labor to that gross margin number is how we get the direct labor efficiency ratio of, so if that gross margin number is say 600,000 and direct labor is 200,000, then direct labor efficiency ratio is, the 600,000 divided by 200, so that'd be a 3, LER. And so we look at labor as a multiplier. So the idea is I could look at labor as a fraction, but once again, we go back to behavioral economics. Tell me whether or not you as a direct labor person, do you want to be known as a multiplier or do you want to be known as a fraction? And I think people like being a multiplier. And so, when I tell that person that, hey, for every dollar I pay you, I need $3 of gross margin, that communicates a whole lot better than saying, hey, I can pay you, 20% of every dollar of gross margin that we get. Well, that's more of a salesman's mindset. That's not a production mindset. And even though, it still, to me, it just doesn't communicate as well. Mm-hmm. And so once we get to direct labor, so gross margin minus direct labor is a term we had to create because it's what most people would refer to as gross profit. But when I was writing the chapter for Verne Harnish's book on profitability in his book Scaling Up, Verne and I had this discussion, and he suggested, let's use gross margin for that first one, and then we agreed on contribution margin as the second subtotal, which in most people's books would be gross profit. We don't like the term gross profit because profit indicates more of an indication of a bottom line number. So we'd like to save the term profit, for the true net profit, of the business.
Got it.
So that's kind of how we define it.
Got it.
But the beauty of it is we believe contribution margin dollars is actually the highest quality number in a P&L. And because it has no discretion in it. It only has your productive people. It doesn't have your cousin that you're employing just because you want to, or, it doesn't have a spouse, who's maybe doing a few things in the business, but not really relevant, to the business or whatever. Or it doesn't have, a lot of times, your labor, that you may be distorting either on the high or the low side. So to a large degree, we really like focusing any type of production metrics, whether it be incentive plans or those things, off of contribution margin dollars. Because with our modeling techniques, we've learned that if you tell me contribution margin dollars, I can predict up to revenue, and I can also predict down to net income. And so that's the other reason why we like it, in that regard. Now, the other beauty of it is contribution margin becomes the dollar amount that we hold management labor accountable to. And so all that other labor that's below that line is management labor and your admin labor. Now you've got something to hold that team accountable to, because they can produce revenue, but if it wastes cost of goods sold or direct labor producing it, so that it doesn't produce any net contribution margin. It was like, well, we didn't gain anything. We did more activity and got less for it. And you'd be amazed at how many times we see people go from $1 million of revenue to $2 million of revenue, and contribution margin stays flat and possibly even goes backwards. And then they're going, we don't understand. Well, it's because you didn't understand. It's about getting the next margin dollar that matters, not top line activity. And so we highly recommend that you never, ever, ever, base anybody's compensation off of a percentage of revenue. Because like I said, we think it's the weakest number there. So the management labor efficiency ratio that is similar to the direct labor efficiency ratio, management labor efficiency is contribution margin per management labor dollar. And so the interesting thing is, in different business models, we've seen direct labor efficiency vary by type of worker and type of business model. Think of it like a sports team. Are you a passing team to where I may have some misses, but when I have a gain, I gain in chunks of yardage? Mm-hmm. Well, that's typically, someone who has a 6 or 7 direct labor efficiency ratio. But it's because I have a very expensive person who's throwing the ball to them in management. Because low cost, highly productive direct labor typically takes a lot of active management. Versus if I have high cost direct labor people, typically professional services environment, you have a much lower direct labor efficiency ratio because you hand them a project, but you don't tell them what to do step by step by step. You've defined it. They're professional. They're self-motivated. They're self-managing. And so generally, professional service firms, accounting, law, architecture, engineering, they have very low direct labor efficiency ratios because you have very low management requirement in that regard. But interestingly enough, once you get to contribution margin dollars, there's a normalization of management labor efficiency. And so what we've seen is somewhere between a 3 and a 4 management labor efficiency. So what we developed is this idea that if you tell me the people on your management team, I take that dollar of wages, multiply it times a minimum of a 3, but really I want to target a 4. So let's say I've got $500,000 in management labor. Mm-hmm. Well, let's say I'm targeting a 4 management LER. So that means that $500,000 in management labor times 4 is $2 million. So I got to have $2 million of contribution margin. Well, if contribution margin is roughly 50% of revenue by the time I've paid for any cost of goods sold and paid for direct labor, I'm now looking at a multiplier of saying I really need 8 times that wage then, or those management wages. So I need, if I got $2 million of contribution margin, I need $4 million of revenue to make that work. Mm. And it's amazing that multiplier effect of management labor all the way up to revenue is 8's a pretty good average across all kinds of business models. And I've seen a low of 6 and a high of 10, somewhere around in there. But it actually is amazing how consistent that number is. And so if it's got a high cost of goods sold but low labor, those things kind of measure themselves out, and you kind of work your way all the way back up to the top. So it is amazing kind of how that modeling piece works. And once again, we're dealing with, we've got even one model that I use where we take all the operating expenses of facilities, marketing, payroll taxes, and other OpEx and just shove it all into one line. So, those all matter, and if you're getting detailed in forecasting, each of those act differently. But you know what? It's amazing, especially if it's a $5 million and under business. Those costs all together kind of move in a fairly consistent percentage as a kind of a slow-moving variable cost, even though some of them are fixed and some of them are variable. And so the idea is, if you really focus on getting what is the productivity I need to get out of the dollars of labor spent, both for management and direct, that tells the story.
My sense is that all the way up till about 12 million, roughly, there's a lot of what you referenced earlier, where there's a lot of funny owner accounting kinds of practices that go on, a muddling of performance labor with ownership distributions, and
right.
all of that gets kind of muddled. And of course, when you go for a transaction, you end up doing some kind of pro forma financial to try to restate that. But you're saying actually it'd be useful to try to clean that up in the beginning so that you can run your business smart.
Absolutely. So let me give you a live example. So I teach this when I do my presentations. So we had this business come to us when they had $600,000 of revenue. I mean, just that they told me it was two guys, 50-50 owners, and they said, we got 25% profit, but we're struggling with cash flow. Can you help?
Yeah.
I go, 25% profit, struggling with cash flow. Something's not right.
Right.
So when I met with them, I realized that they were taking about $120,000 of salary, about $60,000 a piece as wages, except they weren't counting them as wages, they were counting them as distributions. So they really weren't at 25% profit. So once I reclassified their $120,000 in wages, they were at 4% profit.
Right.
And I said, well, we found the problem. You only, instead of thinking that you had $140,000 of profit, you only have 23. And so, okay, so let's get busy. And so the first thing we did is said, all right, at 23,000 of profit, 4% of revenue, you're not demonstrating that you've earned your pay. So that's the first harsh reality that they have to get through their head. It says, all right, so we're going to do it correctly, pay you the $60,000 a piece, and I'm going to hold you accountable to a 3.5 management LER and give you a new target for contribution margin. So you only have to do about $140,000 more in contribution margin, and that then in turn, works out to be, not a whole lot more in revenue. So probably, revenue target, they probably need to be, another, about 140 on top of that, because the thing was, in that case, they were paying the right amount of direct labor. So their direct labor, they had the right people, they just weren't getting enough out of it. So I'm just increasing the rate. So there wasn't this big multiplier effect. I just had to, and the basic principle is I'm spending the right money, I'm just not getting enough for it. So I said, I gave them their new target.
Yeah.
All right, great. So they go out, guess what? They hit it. And so when they did, they got their salary, but they also made $130,000 true net operating income.
Yeah.
19% profit in the first year. I go, great. So that means they were about $700,000 of revenue. I said, good deal. So you've proven that you can do it. You're profitable. Guess what? You need a raise. So we raised them to a little over 100 apiece. Now, when you apply the same math again, so if you take that 200,000 of wages times 3.5, guess what? Now their target is about 700,000 contribution margin. So you jump from 450 to 700. And then from a revenue standpoint, you go from 700,000 of revenue to $1 million in revenue. So those multiplier effects happen really fast. And oh, by the way, you have to hire about $120,000 of additional direct labor because you can't stretch your current team that far. So if you can go get the revenue, if you can go build your team, you have then proven that you've earned your pay. So we said, all right, here's your target, go for it. Well, they kind of did it, but they missed it a little bit. They didn't produce the right amount of gross margin. They were close to their revenue target, but they had to use too much freelance labor to make up for the people that they didn't hire fast enough. Classic scenario of a growth constriction. Yes, it sounds great. In their case, they were able to win the new work. They just weren't able to produce it and hire the team to do it fast enough. So by hiring freelancers, they gave up margin.
Yeah.
But they also then stretched their team to an unhealthy level of productivity. So their direct labor efficiency ratio, instead of a 3, was a 350. So even though that number sounds better when I teach this in the presentations, I say, well, is 350 good or not? And people finally go, oh, yeah, I'm probably burning up my people. Because if my target is 3, I'm probably being a little too aggressive. And that's where your eyes have to balance using the numbers. It's not just about numbers. You've got to correlate what you see with the numbers. You can't rely on one in isolation to itself. But sure enough, they were burning up their team. And so we had to sit down and say, good job, you made 22% profit, over $230,000 in net profit on that activity. I mean, like I said, this is just the second year into this process. They've gone from making $60,000 a piece, $20,000 a profit, to making $100,000 a piece, plus on top of that, real profit of $230,000. And this is just applying these simple principles of targeting and then go do it.
But it really seems like you're doing more than we often get from our tax preparers and our CPAs. You're actually giving them some feedback on, hey, you should consider some different targets and you should do something, not just here's your statement.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I contend that I wish my peers, would be bold enough to do it, but they've not invested like we have in determining, here's what we believe about business. We've studied enough data points to where, we really believe this stuff works. And we've seen it in time and time again. And so, but like in these guys, the same thing that, that you talk about in your coaching in terms of, well, guess what? Their biggest constriction was they weren't able to hire fast enough. So what do they have to do? They have to build a recruiting process that allows them to constantly be trolling for talent and make sure that they hire, at the right time. You got to hire a little bit ahead. Obviously, it'd be a perfect world if you could hire just as you needed it, but that always doesn't come out to be the case. But when we rolled it for the next year, they absolutely nailed their target. They actually oversold again, still had to use a lot of freelance talent, but they hit their gross margin target. And that next year they hit $1.3 million of gross margin, still 22% profit. So they made $330,000 of profit on top of $125,000 salaries apiece. And it's all because we say, once you set your wages as a management team, you hold your management team accountable to what they must do to earn it. And we call it bottom-up targeting.
Yeah.
And as much as people like to start at the top, I really think it does start with hold your management team accountable, or else I got the wrong management team.
It's really powerful. That's really great. Well, and of course, when we implement the LER within a company, as people start to track it, we say there's really three things to go to work on. But the easiest and fastest place to get money is to cut out your unperforming people. So lop off the C players, maybe even some of the marginal B players. And then the next thing is to tighten up the execution habits, look at how well you're executing on plan and what you're doing and whether that's efficient or not. And of course, some of the biggest returns come from improving the targeting, being smarter about what you offer to whom and everything that goes on the strategy side of the equation, but they take longer to implement and pay off.
Yeah. Well, and there's an interesting thing that we started doing that I'm still refining the presentation of it, but I really think it's been resonating with people, is this idea of investing in your business. And so if you think about it, I mean, investing in your business no longer is building a plant like it was in the Industrial Revolution. It's not now if you're in technology, yeah, it might be building a new piece of software, but really, at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is I've got to spend expenses before they're productive. And so that could be, a research and development activity. It could be hiring a key member of management team until they're productive, hiring a salesperson, but they're not going to be productive for 6 months. It could be research and development of new marketing techniques that are unproven. All types of those things. And so when you think about competition for profit, when I wrote my original book, I talked about the 4 forces of cash flow, that once you're profitable, you've got to pay taxes is force number 1. You got to repay debts, force 2. You got to build to your core capital target is force number 3. And then you get to take dividends is force number 4. Well, I mentioned it in taking dividends that you have a possibility of also reinvesting in the business. And I really think I almost would retitle that today the 5 forces, because I would put reinvesting right at the beginning of that chain. Because if I reinvest in the business in an expense, I get to do it in a deductible way. Because if I hire a person, I'm getting to deduct what I'm paying that person today. And so it's a supercharged dollar of tax deductibility, but I do want it to become profitable and productive. You don't ever want to spend $1 to save 40 cents in tax. You really want to spend that dollar to have it produce. But that's just the nature of business. And when you really function, couple that with the idea that a 10% or better profit business that's fully capitalized makes a minimum 50% return on investment, why would you ever not reinvest in your business if it has the chance to grow farther? But there is a risk that it won't work. I mean, that's why, when something comes with 50% return, it generally means it's a higher risk than something with a 2% return. But I teach it in a way that I say, listen, if I gave you $100,000 an opportunity to put $100,000 in a CD that pays 50% interest, well, you hold it in there for a year, and at the end of that year, I got $50,000 interest that I'm going to be paid. I could reinvest it in the CD and roll it for another year at 50%, or I could take it out. How many of you would take out that $50,000 to go spend it to buy a car or consume it some way, or would you reinvest it? Well, everybody says, oh, I'd reinvest it. And I said, well, that's what you're doing to your business. Your business is sitting there screaming, says, if you'll reinvest in me, I'll give you a 50% or better return. Now, there's a point that either, like you mentioned earlier about strategy, if I have maximized the marketplace that I'm in, then that next dollar of investment isn't going to produce 50% return because you've maxed out where that business, in terms of its either geography or product or service offering in the area that you're serving. But, we were talking to a client up in Canada, a couple of weeks ago, and he had pretty much maxed out, his business in the region. But essentially we said, well, but you can always go to another region. You're somewhat doing business there anyway. You just don't have a physical presence. And so it opened up his mind to, well, gee, why wouldn't I go buy a competitor in that arena that's on the small side that can't do what I do, but it's a good foothold to then build on. And, that's a change in mindset because you look at the return potential. Because you could consume it, but how much fun is that? I mean, it's okay for a point, but it's not near as satisfying as building a successful business.
I think you've given people a lot of great takeaways to do. Are there any to think about and to work on? Are there any particular resources that you'd like to point to? We'll, of course, have your website and link in there, but anything that you'd like to focus on?
Yeah, I do think, obviously, my original book, Simple Numbers, Straight Talk, Big Profits, it's available either from my website, Simple Numbers, Not Me, or from Amazon. But also the latest work that I've done, in my original book, I did not do the complete explanation that I just went through of separating direct labor efficiency from management labor efficiency. And in 2011, when I wrote that book, we were in the middle of that research of isolating, those two drivers. And so that work was later included in Verne Harnish's Scaling Up book. So chapter 13 is the chapter I wrote for Verne's book. And so I would highly recommend both looking at my book as well as Verne's book, to be, the most recent stuff that's written. And then I've got, certainly some other articles and stuff we put on the website, the white papers and blogs and those things that people can download. And then also there's I think a 90-minute webinar that's on the Gazelles Growth Institute website that can be viewed. That's kind of my basic presentation of kind of our philosophies and things. So those are pretty good resources to get people familiar with kind of how we look at things, and there's free downloadable templates that are on the book website as well.
Oh, great! So we'll point people to all those links in the show notes, and people can go right to those as follow up. Of course, our client members also get access to all of the Growth Institute videos as part of their retainers. And so, thanks for talking with us today.
Yeah, good deal. I appreciate it, Bill.